Welcome to Green and Gold FC.
And a duel, and then poked home by Tim Cahill. Australia have done it.
Could write the Matildas into history. Cue the party.
The best team of the A-League era. And it goes. Tyler! It's a save that means the world to Australia.
Welcome to Green and Gold FC, the podcast by the fans for the fans. Today we're joined by Rory O'Neill from the YouTube channel Coach Rory. He's known for his sharp insights in grassroots coaching, football development, and the structural challenges of the game in the US. While he's American, the issues he explores, like high junior fees, lack of promotion and relegation, and football being overshadowed by other sports, mirror many of the same struggles we face here in Australia. So let's dive in. How are you going, Rory?
Hey guys, thanks for having me. This actually might be my first international podcast, so I'm honored.
Oh, fantastic. It's great to have you. And as always, we're joined by my co-host, Alex. How are you going?
I'm doing very well, Graham. And look, as a coach myself, Rory, I must say I'm very happy that we've managed to get you on board. So thank you for joining us. Was very happy with our last episode and excited to learn a lot of knowledge regarding the American game and how it lines up against the Australian game and progression of young players.
So let's start with your own connection to football, or soccer as you might call it. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you first got into the game. What sparked your passion?
Yeah, so I think growing up, I did play not at any remarkable level in the United States. And I would say that for maybe the first 30 years of my life, my relationship with football or soccer, as we call it, was really more casual. You know, I would follow the Premier League here and there. When the World Cup sort of got started, I would get really into it. Then the World Cup would go away and I'd kind of fall off a bit. But then I got into coaching, and I got into coaching through my sons. And that really sparked something that I don't know that I can really explain. And maybe only other coaches can explain it, but it sort of drives a passion inside you. And part of the ecosystem here in the United States also drives some of that passion. So I got several coaching licenses, coached kind of all over at many different levels, from grassroots to even at an MLS Next pro kind of youth level. So that sort of sparked and sort of got me into my YouTube channel, which is, I think, what most people, at least who don't know me personally, who know me, they know me from that YouTube channel, which that channel started as really just a way of showing my teams some ideas, whether it be simple patterns, whether it be more complex ways of defending. That's all it really started out as. And it kind of took off. I got a little bit more sophisticated with videos. And then I started posting not just technical or on the field stuff. I started posting some more off the field stuff. And it's really grown to the size it is now, which I'm still very, very humbled and still a little bit shocked that it's at it where it is. And it's afforded me luxuries of being able to talk to guys like you. So that's kind of where I'm from. I've been coaching now for 13, 14 years, year round here in the United States. You know, I have a USC license and a UEFA B license, and I'm very passionate about many aspects of the game.
So your coaching videos, do they cover all ages? Are they mostly for coaching sessions for adults, for 13 to 17, 9 to 13? What ages do you cover?
So we call it phase 1 in the United States. I'm not sure what they call it in Australia, but I would say, while I do have some content on the channel that's more like 11v11 older players, the majority of the stuff is really centered and focused on U12 and under. And really the reasoning behind that was there really wasn't, when I started this coaching journey, there wasn't much out there for that age group. And through sort of my own trials and tribulations, I kind of developed what I thought were the best practices and things that I really enjoyed doing. And so there's a lot of content. I would say most of it is the phase 1 or the U12 and under. But then I have put some things on there because I've coached older teams as well, of the older teams. But the majority of it is the youth game. But it can be really applied to, grassroots. It can be applied to academy level. I mean, the things that I'm doing can be applied to all levels of play.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we call it the skills acquisition phase between 9 and 13, where we focus essentially on trying to pick up skills and technical development. So in Australia, the football has often had a tough time getting mainstream attention. It's sometimes seen as a foreign sport. Sometimes it's seen as not as tough as other codes, not as manly. Have you had similar attitudes or challenges with football in the US?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we are a big, when we say football here, we mean gridiron and helmets and that's the number one sport by a mile. It's probably 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the United States. And, I would say that, 20 years ago, it was soccer or football was very, very small. Other than pockets, there are cultural pockets in the United States, like Southern California, the eastern part of the country. So, for example, New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, where I'm at, they've developed many national players for years. And then there's also, especially recently, kind of this hotbed in Dallas, Texas, and in Miami, Florida. So there are cultural pockets in the United States that have probably always been very, very strong. But now you're seeing a little bit more of a national kind of approach, or a population where the country does seem to be taking that sport, taking soccer, and really embracing it a little bit. So that is getting better, but it definitely still exists. And, you still will get a lot of pushback from certain people, certain cultures of this country to the game, for sure.
So, Rory, you did mention that there are cultural pockets in America where you do see lots of footballers coming through. Now, in Australia, we mostly see this coming through our migrant communities. You'll have certain areas of the country that have people of a different demographic, or, certain ethnicities that sort of tend to congregate in certain suburbs. This happens a lot with our football teams, with lots of them being localized and based specifically around clubs and cultures and nationality and ethnic identity. Some of our biggest clubs, including Preston Macedonia, obviously have a Macedonian community. We spoke with their club president last week, but even other massive local clubs such as South Melbourne having a massive Greek heritage, Adelaide City having a massive Italian heritage. You really do see that a lot of these players come through with certain ethnicities and their own sort of thoughts on the game. And with the areas that you mentioned, I can't help but notice places like Texas, evidently having a larger Mexican population than a large part of the country. A lot of the East Coast, obviously New York, you have a lot of migrants there. And even places like Miami, Florida, I can only imagine that there would be a lot deeper roots of ethnic nationalities in places like these. Do you think that has to do with the reasons why sports have grown in that area, or in particular football has grown in that area more than areas such as the Midwest, or even more profitable, or I guess financially stable areas in the country?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the Latino population and community, I think, for probably ever has been very strong when it comes to soccer. I mean, my father-in-law is Argentinian. He came to this country in 1977, I think, 1976. And he will tell stories of trying to find games on TV in the 80s and 90s. He's actually from Detroit, Michigan, or he lives in Detroit, Michigan now, more of a Midwest area. And, as the sport's grown in this country, there's no doubt that the Latinos have been a huge driver of that. But to your point, there definitely are, pockets of Germans, Polish. There's actually a large Ukrainian population, sort of kind of where I'm at. So, those have been huge drivers of the New York, New Jersey, sort of Eastern aspect of football. And, one of the kind of interesting things, just to kind of maybe steer this in a little bit of a different direction, is you see these communities, as we're talking about here, love the sport, culturally grow the sport. These are also some of the same communities that actually are pricing people out. These are also some of the same communities that can't get the academy level training that some of, let's say, the Midwest or upper middle class and higher families can get. And so while we're seeing, the sport grow, I'm not sure we're necessarily seeing the players come forward in a way that other countries are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fair enough. I imagine we have quite similar issues, and we'll get to that. In Australia, for a long time, it was seen that on the one hand, the migrant communities which were building these football clubs were seen as, like, on the one hand, a boon to the game, but they're also seen as people worried that they were scaring off, I guess, your Anglo-Australian. I know you guys have the term WASP, which would be maybe the similar idea. Did you have any dynamic like that where people thought that the migrant flavor of football and these clubs were scaring off those people, scaring off the WASPs?
Yes, definitely. And I think, there were, at least years ago, and I think that that's changed quite a bit, but quite different styles of play between the traditional American style and, what would be a traditional Latino style. And that it's such a blurred line now, and that's changed. But definitely throughout the years, that has caused, I think, some barriers to growth in the Latino community.
And just following up on the previous question regarding sort of pay to play and people being priced out, look, as someone who's tried to follow as much of American grassroots sort of discourse as I can, I've noticed that it is quite similar to lots of situations we have all across Australia. In particular, the separation between sort of top junior clubs and top regional clubs compared to community clubs. And you look at the fact that our NPL and state league systems are so separated, where you have juniors playing NPL paying up to $2,500-$3,000 a year just for their fees, compared to community clubs where they're maybe paying $300 to $400, and how that sort of splits the reputation between players who go to these big clubs and pay big money because they assume it's better for their development versus players that sort of stick to these community clubs because they can't really afford it, and how many players are sort of priced out of taking the next step in their football career. Now, in Australia, we have massive migrant communities, as I'm sure you can imagine, and some of our best players, including majority of our best players, actually come from these migrant communities. We have a lot of players who have come from South Sudanese refugee camps, and one of our best players, Nesri Irankunda, actually was not able to afford these sort of high-priced NPL fees and actually had to have his fees covered by his junior club, meaning that if he did not have his fees covered by that junior club, we may have never witnessed one of the greatest talents to have come through Australian football and possibly one of the best Australian players ever produced. So my question to you is, what sort of effect do you think pay-to-play has had in the development of players in these migrant communities? Obviously, there are players that have broken through the American system. One that comes to mind for me is Ricardo Pepi, who came from a poorer area in a Mexican-American family and managed to sort of break through that barrier in Dallas, Texas, and become a very, very good young striker. Are there sort of any other, I guess, cases in your experience as a coach where you've seen that pay-to-play has really sort of negatively affected a lot of young players?
Yes, this is sort of a rabbit hole that has almost no bottom. So pay-to-play is a symptom of the disease of not having promotion relegation. So the costs of soccer in America are directly related to the ecosystem that it is on. So the fact that we don't have a way of clubs to get revenue from any other source other than parent tuition is the entire reason we have pay to play. So to answer your question, have I seen it negatively affect players? Almost every team I've ever had. And when you think about this pay to play model, what you're talking about is barriers to entry, in my opinion. So when you start pricing kids out at 7, 8, and 9, you're not going to be able to produce a player from a poor family, let alone migrants. I mean, some of the families in our area of the country are just poor. Like they just don't have the money. And so what you see are kind of two diverging development paths. Like you can stay what you guys would call grassroots, we call recreational. So you can stay recreational and, not pay a lot of money and play, but you're not going to get anywhere near the level of coaching, nowhere near the level of competition, nowhere near the level of training sessions and, peer competition and everything you would need to develop into a great footballer. You're just not going to get that. So you would need some miracle. If you're the best, like a fantastic 7 or 8-year-old, it would take some miracle if you stayed in what we call recreational football to become a professional. The other pathway is you pay. And now there are definitely cases where clubs or other families I've even seen will help pay the costs and the fees for players who are talented. That does happen, but you're missing this huge pool of players. And so, just to continue on that point, like I said, I this is a rabbit hole that I could probably talk for an hour on. The club, it's not the club's fault. Like the clubs don't have any incentive to develop these players because of the ecosystem that we're in. So, there's no incentive for clubs outside of just pure generosity to take a very talented 10-year-old and keep them for free. Because what would happen is that player eventually becomes so good that they leave that particular club for basically nothing. Like in other countries, there are what they call training compensation and solidarity payments. So there are real incentives to developing players. And this all just goes into the idea that the system is not set up for player development, or the ecosystem is not set up in a way that has a merit-based system. So yeah, promotion and relegation and the pay-to-play model, they're all one and the same, but it dramatically affects everything that has to do with American football.
I guess a good sort of place to touch on that is when you consider the fact that, and I could be wrong on this, but considering the fact that there are multiple big football nations and mostly European countries that have gone through extra steps to abolish sort of pay-to-play structures, whether that be Belgium, I believe they to this day continue to cover the costs of junior football in their country. Germany, I think on 2 separate occasions have done this where they've covered the costs of junior football across the nation. Do you think that America, with the introduction of another 2 professional leagues, that being the USL Championship and the USL League One, and I believe USL League Two, I could be mistaken on that, but with the introduction of these leagues, do you think America is going to be taking those extra steps towards abolishing this pay-to-play structure, especially with, the extra demands for these professional players? Obviously, you're going to have more of these young players that are going to be making those long trips or maybe going across the country to search for teams. There's going to be extra financial demand for these players to have to uproot their lives to pursue professional football. Do you think that pay-to-play is on the way to being destructured in the US? Obviously, that would be a massive benefit for US soccer, I feel. You'd see a lot more support from migrant communities and probably a lot more grassroots participation. It's something that I wish we'd do in Australia, and I'm hoping we will do with the introduction of more professional leagues. But do you think in America, pay-to-play will be on its way to being destructured in, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years?
So before I do answer that, I do want to say I don't think pay-to-play is the problem. It oftentimes gets demonized because, like, if somebody wants to set up shop and charge $2,000 for people to come and train, that's fine. But they're like, that's just business. That's just living in a free society. But when that's the only pathway, that's the real issue. And so to get to your question, and I don't want to be super negative, so I really hope I'm wrong, but no, I don't think that it's going away. And the issue with the leagues, whether it be MLS, whether it be USL, and we could talk about USL a little bit if you want to, because they did recently put an announcement out there that they are going to go to a promotion and relegation system, but it's not a real promotion and relegation system. And, a real promotion and relegation system is an open pyramid. So what that means is anybody based on merit on the field could eventually, if everything went right, get to the first division of whatever country you're talking about. That's what a true promotion relegation, a true, open system actually is. What USL is proposing is a open system within their 3 leagues, but you still need to put up $10 million or whatever the number is going to be to get into one of these leagues. So it's really just moving up and down a pyramid of closed leagues. And, MLS is completely closed unless, they like you and you have $300 million. And what happens is this all trickles down to what we're talking about when it comes to youth football. So when you don't have promotion and relegation, there's no pressure. So there's really no pressure for any of the teams to win or lose any of these games, which trickles down to their academy, to their youth. There's not a big pressure other than to keep your job or to not, let's say, be humiliated. And that's a totally different development environment than, if you're fighting for your life to get relegated. I mean, if you get relegated in pretty much every other country in the world, it has massive implications for, every aspect of the club. I mean, people will get fired, coaches will lose their jobs, players will lose salary. I mean, there's oftentimes clauses in contracts where the players will actually, have to take a pay cut when they go down to a certain league. So no, I don't think that pay to play will necessarily go away. And I don't think it going away is really the issue. I think the issue is having an ecosystem that involves an open pyramid that will lead to the right developmental consequences for clubs and coaches.
It is very interesting that pay to play and a closed shop is something that both of our countries have in common. That's a good evidence for the thesis that they are connected, on top of some of the reasons that you gave, specifically how it works and how it drives up youth costs. So let's talk about the closed shop that the US have with the MLS. We also have a closed shop in the A-League. Can you tell us how the closed shop system came about, why they never tried promotion and relegation to start in the US?
So to answer that question, we have to go back to the late 70s in the United States when they had something called the North American Soccer League. And that league actually had Pele in it. They had Franz Beckenbauer. They had some really big names who came over. And they were a little past their prime, actually somewhat similar to how MLS is bringing some players over now. But that league got very, very popular for, I want to say, 5 years or so, and then it kind of financially collapsed. And so from about the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, there was really no first division football in the United States whatsoever. And so when MLS was formed, and that was around the World Cup in 1994, in fact, one of the requirements that FIFA actually gave was for the United States to host the World Cup is they had to develop a first division league. So when they were developing this league, they had this, failed NASL in the back of their mind. And so what they did was basically backroom door and use their political connections with FIFA to say, hey, I don't know if this league's going to work in the United States. What we're going to do is we're going to run it kind of how we run the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball in this country, which is a closed system. And that's kind of the framework of how it was developed. And not to get too deep into the weeds on this, there really isn't any club in MLS. So every club, and I use that very loosely, they're not clubs. Every team in MLS is actually owned by MLS. Like they have franchisees, they have quote owners who are franchisees, but at the end of the day, they're all the same entity. And so, that system just sets up everything I talked about, where what happens on the field just doesn't mean anything. And it's really more of an entertainment product than it is a cultural driver, where you look at clubs in most countries around the world, they drive the culture of even the city itself. You have people, who don't have any real connection with the club other than they live in the city, who, live and die with the club, who go to matches, who, even support the club with membership fees. Most clubs, and when I say clubs, I'm talking about youth clubs in the United States. Once your kid is done with that club, you're done with the club. You don't have any, it's a very transactional relationship. So all of that is a product of having a closed league.
Yeah, Australia doesn't really have that sort of promotion and relegation that, a lot of European leagues have. And I'd say for a large part, it's been mainly, I'd say, a cancer on the Australian football system. And look, we did have sort of closed systems back in the day of the NSL, but I'd say it was more offset by the fact that we had a lot of ethnic-based clubs, to the fact that these clubs were, for a large part, economically feasible. They were kept alive by large groups of supporters. The league was very well liked. You have massive, migrant turnouts, lots of passionate fans that really got behind the separate cultures of the clubs. But now the A-League just sort of feels lifeless, you know what I mean? And I'll say this as a Perth Glory supporter. In terms of actual club culture, there's not really a lot. The club, I'd say, probably hangs on to English roots. Most of the chants are English. The team song is derived from the Manchester United team song. But apart from that, there's no real culture. And it's really clear when you go to a Glory game that they're sort of there for entertainment. They don't tap into, I guess, any communities or anything like that. And I've been very vocal on this on social media numerous times that, Perth Glory and I'd say majority of A-League clubs don't do enough to engage with local communities. And I feel that's a big reason why the league has not only failed to grow, but regressed heavily in recent decades. And even while single league or non-promotion relegation codes such as the AFL or the NRL, while they continue to succeed and grow, the A-League hasn't really done so. And look, you can say that's down to the fact that, AFL and NRL are just bigger sports in Australia, but I'd say it has to do with the fact that I feel like the A-League has lost touch or even lost faith with the migrant communities. There's a lot of work that Football Australia put in to actually distancing themselves from these migrant communities, whether it be forcing certain clubs to change their names or change their badges. Just recently this year, Preston Lions were able to change their name back to Preston Macedonia. South Melbourne were able to finally be known as South Melbourne Hellas. And Adelaide City were finally able to add the Italian flag back to their badge. They were actually banned from having the Italian flag on their badge. So I guess they're taking, or at least they're trying to take steps to re-engaging these communities. But I feel like that was a massive miss and why the sport has just failed to grow in its entirety. I think sport in Australia, loves to tap into the neutral fan. There's not too many hardcores and they like to make hardcores out of neutral fans. But I feel the problem is neutral fans really need something to grab onto, whether it's heated rivalry or whether it's success or, just real competition. They need something to grab onto. And with the NRL and the AFL, I feel like what they have to grab onto is the fact that they genuinely are some of the best leagues in the world, whether it be for rugby or AFL, with it being the only league in the world for the sport. I genuinely do feel like the A-League has failed to do so because of the lack of tapping into migrant communities that actually care about the growth of the game, and also because of the fact that the quality is just not up to the European standards. So it is interesting to see how similarly, at least in Australia and America, the sport has failed to grow in parts due to the fact that it fails to tap into certain communities. But it's hopefully a problem that will get fixed eventually with there being more promotion relegation, with there being more stakes on the line, people actually having a reason to turn out week in, week out to support their clubs. Hopefully that's something that is fixed in the future with promotion relegation in both countries.
Yeah, one of the things that actually is happening now with Messi coming is that we're finding that this entertainment, or at least the initial returns, may not be what people thought. The initial 10-year deal that Apple signed is not looking very good as far as the numbers, the viewership numbers, and sort of what they thought was going to happen. Because again, when you bring in soccer or football as an entertainment product, that's really what you're getting, and you're not getting that cultural buy-in. So yeah, Messi's going to be here for however long he's going to be here, but then what happens after that? How many people are going to be following Inter Miami when he leaves? What you're talking about 100% is kind of what's happening here, and I think we're finding that it's failing in many respects.
The A-League has leaned on marquee signings for short-term buzz, and MLS has done something similar with designated players like Messi. But given the drop-off in impact over time, are these big-name signings actually helping either league build something sustainable?
No, they aren't. You get this short-term kind of, impact, but it doesn't really lead to, long-term growth, in my opinion. You get this entertainment product, but it doesn't really build anything. I mean, the vast majority of players who come here are basically past their prime. And it generates a lot of interest, a lot of, people get excited. But I mean, you could count the number of people who have come over here, whether it be Zlatan, whether it be David Beckham, all these players who are past their prime, who come here and then they just leave. And there's really nothing that happens. Even if they do win trophies, it just doesn't seem to really mean anything or really sustain any type of real growth. I know what MLS points to as far as, our attendance and we're generating more money and all of that, which is true. Like, you can't deny that there has been growth, no doubt. But the question is it the growth that is going to sustain and eventually get this league into a conversation of being a top 10 league in the world? I don't believe that myself because of the lack of an open pyramid.
So let's break down what some of the causal pathways are for promotion and relegation driving junior fees up, because that's something we have both in common. We have high junior fees, we have high promotion and relegation. You mentioned that there's multiple sources of revenue if you're in a open league system. Can you basically break that down? Like, what are some of the numbers? It sounds like, okay, you produce a Christian Pulisic. Okay, that's one club, but there's 2,000 clubs in Australia. I'm not sure how many there are in America. Can that really be a sustainable revenue for all the clubs? And what are some of the other revenue sources? How does promotion relegation cheapen things?
So you really just have to look at how other countries do it. It's not really any type of secret formula or any type of, cloak and dagger. Basically, the first thing you have to do is like determine what type of club are we talking about? Because, when I talk about this, the first kind of pushback I will get from other, international people is they'll think I'm talking about what they term as a grassroots club. And so if you have a grassroots club or a recreational club, as we call it, I'm not talking about that. So grassroots clubs traditionally are very low in cost. Sometimes they're subsidized even by certain governmental grants and things like that. What I'm talking about are, at least in America, what we would call competitive clubs. So this would be higher level, academy, pre-academy, things like that. So how many of those clubs are there? In America, at least let's just say there's 1,000 or 500. I'm not sure what the number is, but it's not a huge number. There's a decent number. The way that you would make money in an open system, there's several ways, but the first would be that almost every open system club has a first team. So there would be revenue that you would get from the first team. And again, I'm not necessarily talking about, Arsenal or Manchester City. This could be the 5th, 6th, 7th division in England. You have the first team. And so you have games, you have concessions, you have tickets, you have people who come and watch. You have also a youth system that you're developing players for that first team. So that gets into the player development side. The other forms of revenue, you can actually sell players to other clubs. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, it's called training compensation and solidarity payments. So this is a FIFA sanctioned calculation. So from the age of 12 to 21 or 22, whenever you're at a club, there's a percentage, and it's a mathematical calculation of how much money that club would get for every transfer that player has for the rest of their career. So if you develop a professional, it doesn't even have to be like a world-class player. You develop any type of professional, and that professional gets to whatever level they get to, and they're 30 now. And they're in the 3rd division of English football, and they get sold to the 2nd division of English football for $100,000, whatever it might be. Let's say that the youth club, who's currently in the 5th or 6th division or whatever, who knows where they are, they develop that player from the age of 12 to 15. There's a mathematical calculation that they would actually get money for that. And that's actually, there's a report out 2020 that UEFA put out there showing the percentages. And there's actually a pretty high percentage of revenue that goes to these competitive teams that come from solidarity payments. The other form of revenue that you have is in membership fees. So what I actually just mentioned before, there are several people who will give $50, $100 every month just to the club they support, whether they have a player in the youth academy or not. That doesn't happen in America. Like if you don't have a kid in one of your local clubs, it's very unlikely that you're just going to give them $50 a year. And again, that gets into culture, that gets into promotion relegation, that gets into all of that. So when you have an ecosystem that can, support other forms of revenue, you don't have to charge parents as much tuition.
Let's turn our attention to coaching education. You've been through both the American system and the European system getting your UEFA B license. What does coaching education look like in America?
Yeah, it's kind of a hodgepodge. You start in really a grassroots environment. And so US Soccer has, a few grassroots courses, and my issue with some of the stuff that happens in the grassroots courses, I don't know if it prepares you to coach grassroots players. Some of the education is more nebulous, not necessarily, focused on specific technique, which in the grassroots is so important, as I'm sure most coaches know. And you have to do a lot of your own kind of self-taught education. As you move through the system, as far as, United States soccer has changed this quite a bit. There used to be an F license, then an E, then a D, then a C. And now they just kind of have these grassroots courses, and then you kind of go straight into a D class. And a lot of the education, at least in the United States, is based on how to coach and kind of what I would call more fluff type stuff. It doesn't necessarily get into, real soccer specific technical and tactical elements. Whereas, my experience going through the UEFA side of things, it was a lot different. They were more focused on specific technical and tactical aspects of it. And, it's a lot of self-taught stuff, and going through the courses, there aren't necessarily specific standards. Like my C course was different than a lot of my contemporaries' C course. Each state actually runs their courses up until the C. So you don't actually have a national there's a national curriculum, but the specific instruction goes through the states until you get to the B license. And then when you get to the B license, it's more regional. And then when you get to the A license, they only have it in certain areas of the country. Like Kansas City is the main place, but there's a couple of others. So for me, I don't, this was actually part of what kind of inspired the YouTube channel is I don't think there was a lot out there, especially for U12 and under, for coaches who are either at grassroots or slightly higher into the competitive space for younger players.
Yeah, I'd say my experience personally with coaching in Australia has been relatively similar. There's not a lot of support for more community coaches and stuff like that. And look, as someone who's been coaching since the age of 14, I'd say I've worked my way up similarly to a few young coaches. What I have noticed in Western Australia in particular, which is where I live, is that not a lot of young people are getting into coaching. In fact, being 21, I would have expected to see a few young coaches. I genuinely don't believe I've ever met a coach as young as myself that coaches in any regard, which is quite crazy to me and also partly scary as to sort of how much coaching in this country really relies on volunteers and how there's not much ambition, I guess, with young people. And look, this isn't to blame young people or anything, but I just don't think Football Australia, or in my case at least Football West in particular, have made it enough of a want or desire for young people to get into stuff like coaching. And look, in my experience with coaching, it's taught me very valuable life skills. I think I've improved in not only my ability to sort of understand people and their emotions and motives, but even other skills that I think I'll carry for the rest of my life, which is how to be able to sell a project to someone, how to sort of help people through a rough patch, whether it's loss, whether it's frustration, whether it's disappointment. And those are, I think, some of the beautiful things of coaching. And it's sad that not many young people in Australia getting to experience what I have experienced, with it genuinely being one of the best experiences of my life. And look, as someone who's ambitious and wants to go as far in coaching as they can, I really admire the level that you've managed to get to and the work that you do to, I guess, help out other coaches with a lot of your content. Now, with Australia, I'd say the main problem is the fact that we mainly rely on volunteer coaching up until the level of first teams. And first teams at every club mostly have their paid coaches. I do know of in WA some state league teams that, and you've got to remember, this is the second or third highest tier of football in the state. These coaches are also volunteers, which to me is absolutely crazy. But considering that, do you think America, or at least maybe not do you know of any issues America has in sort of having to rely on volunteer coaching? Is a lot of it better in terms of the quality of coaching at a community level? Or do you think there is also that serious lack of, I guess, experience and support for these young coaches at a community level? And do you think that impacts player development in any way?
It absolutely impacts player development. And yeah, I would echo my experiences are very similar when it comes to community clubs and community coaches. The vast majority of them are unpaid volunteers, and most of them are parents that have a kid on the team. Especially in America, a lot of them have never played the game. They're only familiar with other sports, not soccer at all. And they don't really get any support. I mean, they don't even get like session plans from the clubs or even from US Soccer. The coaching education is really designed, at least in the United States, for more competitive scenarios. And even then, the costs of coaching education I mean, to get a C license is $1,000. So, as far as the grassroots clubs and just coaches starting out, I think that has been actually part of what has made my YouTube channel so successful is I'll get emails all the time saying, hey, I'm coaching a middle school team. I'm coaching an elementary school team. I'm coaching a rec team. I found this really helpful and maybe they have questions because there's just very little out there and there's very little that the state or the federation or the club actually does to help them. I mean, it's so funny. Like one of the things that happens, and I'm sure you as a coach understand, quite intrinsically, Alex, is, oftentimes you will plan a session for 12 players, but only 9 show up or something like that. Well, what do? I mean, if you're a new coach, that can be a real curveball. And so, just simple things like that, you would think that would be part of coaching education, and it's nowhere to be found, at least in the United States.
Yeah, look, that's been a real kicker for me as a junior coach. And one of the things that I also think, this might just be my particular case or the area that I coach in, but one thing that I think a lot of new coaches don't even understand, and this may be completely unrelated, but just something that I wanted to throw in there. Religious commitments for me have been one of the big sort of struggles, especially the fact that large portions of every squad I've ever coached at the junior level having kids that Muslim, especially during the month of Ramadan, it's incredibly difficult to be able to have these young kids competing at that sort of high level, training at a good intensity. You often get players that don't turn up. You often get players that have to end early or break fast or have to take time out of the session to pray. Even having players drop out. And this was one of, a very unfortunate situation where I had to have a player who was very promising and was going to be going on a trial with the Zimbabwean under-16s national team, had to pull out of football entirely due to religious commitments. And it's stuff like that that I don't think a lot of coaches know how to deal with when they first get thrown into that scenario. And it's another reason why I really do feel like education, not just on coaching in general, but how to deal with certain situations like that is really needed, especially at the grassroots level, because I do think that even with volunteers, the work that they already do to ensure that the game, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in America, whether it's in other countries like England or France or Belgium, the work that volunteers put in makes football what it is. It is a global game that anyone can play or participate in. And the fact that on top of everything, they're also having to juggle all these different factors, it really makes me wish that there was more support for people in these communities. And it's definitely something that I'm hoping as a global thing, FIFA or, just individual federations can improve.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. The things that come up for grassroots coaches and, where I'm at, we actually have a large Amish community. So that the issue of religious, obligations actually does come up. But just in general, like, how do you talk to parents? That's not anywhere in our coaching education at all. And if you're a grassroots or a newer coach, that can be a big challenge, just that. So, just some of the really specific day-to-day things that coaches go through are really not part of the coaching education.
So one similarity between the US and Australia is that we both have traditionally been seen as physically strong, athletic teams, but maybe lacking in technical sharpness and technical ability. I know that there's been some development programs in the US. I know they have MLS Next, and perhaps they have other initiatives as well, but maybe those are leaving a bit too late. Are there any other initiatives which they're doing to improve their technical ability over there? And are they actually making any difference?
I think in the last 20 years, the overall technical average of the American player has gone up dramatically. And I don't know if that is because of some initiative in particular, if that is just the growth of the game in general, if that's the fact that we now have, MLS and MLS academies that do produce players or trying to produce players. I can give you a little story. So my wife is from Argentina, and we go usually every other year or so. And when we go, several times I'll put my sons in some of their professional academies down there. They're actually very warm and welcoming and just kind of let you in, like, oh yeah, sure, come train with us. And they're like a first division Argentine team. They're youth clubs, of course, the youth part of their club. But, when they went there, and they're pretty good players. I mean, they're pretty technical. The difference in the Argentine player versus my sons, I didn't really think there was a big technical issue. And both of my sons play in MLS next, which is kind of considered, there's some debate, but it's generally considered the top, youth league in the United States. So they play at a pretty high level. There wasn't a technical deficiency when you compared them to Argentine players. I think it was more tactical. I think that the Argentine players culturally had a better understanding of the game. And I do think that they were more physical in terms of how they use their bodies in games. But as far as other initiatives, I'm not necessarily aware of any other initiatives that MLS or MLS Next has.
Okay, so we've done a massive overhaul of our coaching system in Australia in order to try and produce more technical players. And it's been massively controversial. We've gone to small-sided games, phase out ball-free fitness training and all that. And there's been a lot of concerns about it. One of the concerns is maybe we're producing robots, maybe we're telling people that there's only one way to play, and maybe we're teaching people to be more athletically focused rather than technically focused. Yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how to teach technical development and use small-sided games without stifling a player's creativity.
Yeah, I'm surprised that this is so controversial, and maybe it's just that people aren't aware of kind of what other countries are doing. I know we were kind of talking before this got started. This is something that most developed football nations are doing. It's something called Fanino. It started in Spain by actually a German. Actually, I think he was a hockey coach, believe it or not, who got into soccer. But it's essentially the idea that the youngest players need to play small-sided games, that they need to have as many touches as possible on the ball. So, most of it is related to, the youngest players. So really, 10, 11 and under, and you're playing, 2v2, 3v3. You're focused on mostly, foot skills and getting the basics. This is really, prominent, in Croatia. This is actually one of the reasons, or at least people argue one of the reasons Croatia was so fantastic for a decade, where they got to the World Cup final and the World Cup semifinal. I wish we were doing this in this country, and I don't know why we're not in America. I think the fact that you're starting this in Australia is awesome, and I don't know why anybody would be against it. I really don't. The United States, I think, will eventually come along to this. I certainly hope they do. They literally just a month ago implemented a program very, very similar in Canada. So this is becoming, people are starting to understand this is the how you develop players. But, I wonder if it's just kind of the old school culture, or the people who might be against such things who aren't just keyed in to how great it's going in Belgium and Spain. And England just did this. England just did this last year. They just switched their whole model to something very similar you're describing. I mean, if the best countries in the world are doing this, and Brazil has done it with futsal for years. If the best countries in the world are doing it, who are winning the World Cups, I'm not sure why anybody could argue against it.
Yeah, this is a great point. And look, I've noticed that especially in recent years, I'm starting to notice that there's a direct correlation between the success of sort of national youth teams and also the prominence of sports such as futsal in the country. You look at a lot of growth in Southeast Asia and a lot of, the countries that, I guess, growing in success with their national youth teams, or what national youth teams tend to do well. You have countries like Uzbekistan and Iraq that do really well at a sort of national youth level that don't really follow through to the senior level. But then you look at the most prominent sports in their country, and futsal for them is right up there in importance with actual 11v11. And even other countries like Thailand, futsal's massive there. Vietnam, futsal's massive there. The Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia. Futsal is just massive all across Southeast Asia, which is, I think, a big reason why the sport is growing. And look, even in other coaching aspects, I feel like countries such as the USA and Australia, I feel like those next steps to developing the technical abilities of young players couldn't come soon enough. I feel like they are known for producing great athletes, both America and Australia alike. And I think that's down to the fact that both countries have such rich sporting cultures, which is ironic when you consider that the two countries that in the top 5 for the most obese countries in the world per capita have such rich sporting cultures and produce great athletes. But I also feel like that sort of rich culture needs to be nurtured and sort of not replaced, but I guess molded into this whole curriculum surrounding supporting the actual technical development of young players. And look, this is something that I've been heavily emphasizing in my career as a coach. And even to this day, coaching under 18s teams, I prioritize 5v5 and 7v7 drills to ensure that they are focused on stuff like moving in small spaces, being able to actually pass and move, structure, and, actual change your formation as in accordance to game situations. This is something that I don't think enough youth teams are actually employing at least. I do hope that this improves, and I am happy to see countries like Canada introducing it. Even in WA, we've made changes to our football system. I don't think it's come into effect in New South Wales and Victoria, but in Queensland and WA, we've actually made the change that football at an 11-a-side level doesn't come into under 14s. As of last year, it was under 13s. This year, we've pushed it back a year, which I think is a great step and hopefully something that's going to help the game develop further in the future.
Yeah, I think the other thing that, at least in the United States, that we're seeing, which I'd be interested to know if this is the case in Australia, is that around that age 13, we see a big drop off in participation. And, one of the things that small-sided games, do is they really keep kids engaged. I mean, the more the ball is at your feet, the more you like the sport, the more you want to play. And so that has aspects, all over the place. But that's just one of the things that small-sided games potentially could do for us.
We do indeed see a drop-off from around about 15 to 17. So hopefully as these small-sided games filter through, that'll be one of the factors to keep people in the game. I want to talk about one of the more controversial parts of our coaching education, which also has a parallel in the USA. There is an idea that from the ages of 13 to 17 that everyone should learn 4-3-3 and learn to play a similar style, with the idea that if we have a homogenous style, that no matter what you learn at club football, no matter all the different ways of playing the game, that when you get called up for your national team, you know how to play and it's easier to play that style. And of course, the other justification is that 4-3-3 is the hardest method to learn. So all other styles which you can learn once you've learned 4-3-3. I know that Jurgen Klinsmann tried to implement something similar in the US. Can you talk to us about the pros and cons of that approach?
Yeah, I mean, Jurgen Klinsmann came in as both the national team head coach as well as the technical director for US Soccer kind of in the early 2000s and changed the education. So the coaching education changed specifically to a 4-3-3, kind of similar to what you're describing. And there was definitely a big backlash to it. I can definitely see the pros and the cons. I mean, if the entire national team is playing a certain way, the entire country is playing a certain way, when you get to the national team, the senior national team, certainly that would be more congruent and better. I can also see the negative side of things. I mean, part of learning to adapt, part of, learning how to deal with different situations that happen, both as a coach and as a player on the pitch, is when you see it differently. And there's no doubt that the way I see the game is different than the way Alex sees the game. That is different than the way, the Latino population in the United States sees the game versus the Polish population. So the different styles of play, like I think there's definitely an advantage to playing against different styles and different formations. And it also gets to, I think, a slightly different topic of, how a national team should really play. I don't think that, a national team necessarily should play a certain way just because. I think it should play how the team's, roster construction is best, allowed. So if you have a team that can play a, possession-based style and build out of the back, you should do that. If you have to stay in a low block and counter just because that's what you should do, I think sometimes there's this ideal thought that we should be playing a 4-3-3 and this is how we should play. And I don't know that when you're coaching a national team that necessarily, it's not like you're coaching a club team and you're training them every single day and, you can work on all these little aspects of things. But in general, that has now gone away with Klinsmann leaving, and the coaching education is not necessarily centered on the 4-3-3. To sort of maybe add one more thing to that, when I mentioned, the UEFA class, so my UEFA C license, actually the entire curriculum was set around the 4-3-3. And I don't think that was necessarily set up for any type of national team. It was just to start to give you some context. So you'd be talking about, all right, everything we do and everything about this course and this coaching education class is going to be around a 4-3-3. So we're going to talk about attacking in the wide areas from a 4-3-3. We're going to talk about defending in the central areas in a 4-3-3. It just gave you like a framework to deal with.
Yeah, I agree with you in that there's definitely pros and cons with, having a whole national curriculum based around one system. But to me, I more see negatives around it. And look, this may be sort of against your opinion or with your opinion. I'm certain the listeners of the podcast will have their own sort of thoughts. But to me, I don't like the idea of encouraging young players to be one-dimensional. And I'm not saying that, it's sort of looked down upon to go outside of a 4-3-3, but the idea of sort of encouraging this one style of play that every team should focus their young players on, even if it is a difficult system to learn, that being a 4-3-3, I just feel like it's something that goes against the actual creativity and the actual idea that players need to explore and go outside of the box when it comes to their styles of play or when it comes to their actual experience or enjoyment or understanding of the game. And look, a crazy experience for me was when I did take that step up from being an assistant coach to actually sort of taking my own team. I took an under-16s team for the first time last year, and I had an assistant coach who'd been coaching for a while but wanted to take a step back, and I suggested to him that we had our team play a 4-2-3-1, which in theory isn't actually that far in shape off of a 4-3-3. It just has an extra pivot, and obviously in terms of a game that makes a massive difference, but a lot of people would say that it's not actually that much of a difference in terms of shape. And I brought this up to him and he says, you shouldn't do it because I don't think that they would even have the slightest idea how to play it. And that to me was crazy, considering that a lot of these boys were 15, 16. Some of them had been playing the game for 7, 8 years now. So the idea that some of them wouldn't be able to adjust to the fact that we were moving essentially one midfielder was absolutely outrageous to me. And, I feel like there's a serious problem with the fact that football constantly changes. I don't think that anyone in the 1980s or the 1990s could have predicted that football would look the way it does nowadays. You look back at the olden days where it was a lot more physical, a lot more long balls, a lot more emphasis on physical play, whereas now it's movement of the ball, attacking certain spaces, overlapping, overloads. And, a lot of kids that 17, 18, if I asked them in previous years before tiki-taka became a thing, they wouldn't even know what the word inverted meant, let alone how to play as an inverted fullback. So when you do really set these kids up to play one style of play, it does to me seem counterintuitive to that idea that you should let players explore sort of in their younger careers and learn how to experiment, whether it's in or outside of the football pitch. And that's something that I try to encourage my players to do in terms of trying different formations, maybe not too many, but even making slight changes. Instead of a 4-3-3, try a 4-2-3-1. Instead of playing with a 4-back, maybe we try a 3-back or a 5-back. It's something that I think is vital, but also something that I think is being lost in the current generation of coaches coming through.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. At least when you get into the older teams like that, I think it's essential to at least have two formations that your teams are comfortable with. You're clearly going to be going against teams that are sometimes better than you, sometimes weaker than you. So just in general as a coach, they're very different approaches if you're playing a team that's quite superior versus a team that isn't. And it would certainly stifle development if I am really surprised at the story you just told, Alex, that the assistant coach didn't think they could go from a 4-3-3 to a 4-2-3-1. It's, to your point, it's really not a massive undertaking, especially if you have 15-year-olds. If you got 10-year-olds, yeah, then you got a problem. But if it's a 15-year-old, they can get that pretty quickly.
Now, we'll move on to more US men's national team, in particular Mauricio Pochettino. Now, Pochettino came in with huge fanfare, obviously started out as an assistant manager in women's football, made the transition to men's football, first started out with Espanyol and has coached clubs such as Tottenham, Chelsea, Paris Saint-Germain, for example, and has been an incredibly successful coach in terms of men's football at club level specifically. Now, I know a lot of American fans weren't exactly too excited when they replaced Greg Berhalter with a coach that had never had national team experience or experience coaching a national team by themselves in general. But there was also a lot of hype around Pochettino being this fantastic coach that has had such great success at the European level. Obviously, it hasn't been the best start. The loss to Panama and Canada, and overall just the poor performance in the Nations League sort of indicates that there may be some struggles going forward. Now, obviously, there were a few injuries to the American team, players such as Anthony Robinson being a massive, massive miss in those games. Do you think that there's going to be more problems with the American national team? Do you hope Poch can fix this? Do you see him being able to fix this with the current crop of players that he has? And especially with the American World Cup coming up next year, are you going to be expecting America to be a side that is going to be competitive, I'd say? Obviously, not everyone, well, I'd say very few people would be imagining America would be going too deep into the tournament. Maybe reaching the round of 16 or quarterfinal phase could be a very big achievement for them, especially at a home World Cup. But do you expect this American team to be competitive? And do you see that there is much progress to be made under Poch? Or would you rather see someone who's more knowledgeable of international management sort of take the helm?
So I think, for the last 6 years or however long Greg Berhalter was the coach of the U.S. men's national team, the narrative in general was we don't have the coaching acumen to go up against the top teams in the world. We have the players, but we don't have the coach. And, when they brought in Pochettino, I don't think many people could say he wasn't a top level coach. You could pick at his resume here and there, and some people will do that. But in general, we've never had a coach of this stature coach the national team. So, it is early goings, and you did mention that we have some injuries, but I think we really have to start looking in the mirror and asking ourselves, do we really have a player pool that can compete with the best in the world? And while we have individual talents, and we've had players who have been in the top 5 leagues in the past, but not ever this many. So if we have all these players who are playing in, some of the best leagues in the country, why is the national team not doing that well? I think it's just a massive, recalibration of where some of these players are. And, my biggest concern about the national team right now really isn't the coach. I think we do have a very good coach. You can argue his resume here and there. The issue to me is the player pool, and it gets back into everything we've been talking about since we started this podcast. So are we producing enough players, number one? Are we producing enough quality players, number two? And I think the answer to both of those is a resounding no. When you look at our best players in the current pool, the vast majority of them were not developed in this country. They were developed outside of the country. So Anthony Robinson, who you mentioned, Serginho Dest, who was also injured, Christian Pulisic left this country when he was 14. So, when you talk about that development phase, we call it in America the performance phase, really, 14 to 18. I'm not convinced the United States produces professional players. I think that they produce college players, which there's nothing to be ashamed of in that. But most of our academies are sending players to, nice colleges, very good college programs, but we're not producing professionals. If you look like other countries are selling teenagers for millions of dollars every week. We have a player here and there where you hear that happening, but for the most part, the system, the closed system that is in our top league, it's a trickle-down effect. So it gets into why it costs so much, why we are excluding so many players, while we don't have the developmental initiatives to get players to that level. And it all feeds into the fact that we don't have a player pool who can compete with, the top 10 teams in the world. It's just very evident. So I will actually say I do think we will do well in the World Cup. I'll be surprised if we don't, only because when you look traditionally at the World Cup, most of the time the home team does very well. I think that there is a home advantage. So, even South Korea, I think, got to the quarterfinals when it was in South Korea. So I'm expecting us to do well. How far we will go, I would say the quarterfinals are the ceiling. more than likely, depending on who we were to play in the round of 16, we probably would lose there. But it wouldn't shock me if we got to the quarterfinals and maybe had a shot just because it's on home soil.
Now, we've talked a lot about the improved number of players playing in Europe, in particular the top 5 leagues, and some of the impressive technical qualities, but maybe not having the player pool. But one fact I noticed when watching the US teams, and I hope this isn't a sore spot, but I noticed that there were a lot of the goals you're conceding, as well as some of the moments also in attack. There seems to be some effort areas which aren't quite there. Like, for example, the goal you conceded against Uruguay, I believe, there's like 3 Uruguayan players on a loose ball, on a second ball. I could probably go through, same with the Panama game. There's quite a few times where I was a little bit surprised, just some of the basic effort areas, you seem to be outmatched. Is there an area on that more traditional grit that we expect from US, which maybe we're not seeing as much lately?
Definitely. I think that the teams of the past always had a chip on their shoulder, always knew that they were going to be outgunned, no matter who we would play. I mean, we used to go against Mexico and be significantly outmatched, but we would go toe-to-toe with them just from a player-to-player perspective. I don't know if it is just a cultural thing with maybe the new sort of players and the age. I don't know what it is exactly, because there's no doubt that the culture of teams of the past was very different than it is currently. And you've hit the nail on the head there. Effort is just an expectation of walking in the door. I mean, we shouldn't have to be, wondering why players who are playing for the U.S. men's national team aren't looking like they're giving effort. Why aren't they showing up in shape? That kind of thing, it wouldn't even be tolerated on my youth teams, let alone the teams that are playing, for their national team. So there's a huge cultural issue, and I don't know that I can necessarily explain the reasons for it, but it absolutely is a part of why the team's performing so poorly now.
Now, just to touch a bit more on player effort. Now, this is a bit of a problem that we've sort of noticed with Australian football, maybe with the national teams in some stages. There's a direct quote from a person who I deeply respect in Australian football, a talent scout named Alan Derriard, and he says that the reason that Australian youngsters in a large scale fail to compete overseas is not because they lack technically or lack on a physical level. In fact, we've got very capable physical players, but the fact that they are lacking mentally. Now, a lot of Australian youngsters, when you're going overseas, you have to consider the fact that they're competing against, players that have come from Africa or players that have come from South America, or in general, just really rough upbringings, whether it's poverty or whether it's, several hard situations that they've had to fight through in their life. And look, with American and Australian football, or just the countries in general, especially being first world countries, it is interesting that we do see a lot of perceived sort of lacks of effort. Now, I was just wondering to you, Rory, because obviously as a coach, I've seen it numerous times where you have a player, and it's the most frustrating thing in the world when you have a player with all the ability, but just doesn't really want to put in the effort, or maybe they don't want to have to go through the struggles of putting through that much effort. When you do have those sort of players that haven't really experienced that sort of struggle of a rough upbringing, or maybe just having to really push through struggle in their life, when the going does get tough and a player maybe doesn't want to deal with having to put in that extra effort, how do you deal with that as a coach? And in particular, do you think that sort of lack of a desire to improve, a desire to put in that extra effort, do you think that's lacking maybe on a larger scale in the men's national team for the US?
Yeah, I think you've absolutely hit it. I think that there are a couple of aspects to this and that trickle up effect to the national team. The first is just, again, as we talked about earlier, the majority of the players who are playing at a high level in the United States can pay for it. Outside of, we do have free academies at the MLS level, but that's only 30 clubs. Everybody else has to pay. And, the large portion of the country really has not the ability to do that. So it becomes an issue of how do you afford it? And the kids who can afford it usually have better lifestyles. They're not particularly, in need of food, not to be dramatic, but I think that is sometimes a little bit overblown, where we talk about the player who came from poverty, who, Because again, I have some experiences with my sons in Argentina, and the vast majority of those players, while they weren't necessarily wealthy, were not necessarily dirt poor either. But there's a level of competition and a level of culture that is kind of ruthless. And part of it is involved with promotion relegation. Part of it is the fact that they are literally fighting for the club's life in many aspects, not just the top team, but they're trying to get to that top team. And so many other countries' ecosystems are built to develop this grit you're talking about. Whereas, in the United States, even again, the top teams, when they win or lose, it doesn't mean really anything for anybody. So the coaches don't feel it all the way down, even into the youth level. The players don't really feel it. And you get very relaxed. You get very comfortable. Whereas, in many other countries, you could lose your spot at any time. They might bring in somebody from Africa, from Australia, that they have on loan for 2 weeks, and they're a center back and you're a center back. You're now against this guy for the next 2 weeks for your job, or, on any level. So that's, I think, all wrapped up into the culture of the current national team in the pool.
Sounds like we're both in a very similar spot, trying to get players to make it overseas and show that grit and effort while producing more technical players, but being frustrated by the ecosystem that we've produced at home, which is designed for entertainment. To be fair, in a system where it's very, very difficult to capture the attention of a large audience due to other codes. So I really hope that the national team for the US and the ecosystem over there improves, as well as our ecosystem as well. We seem to be twin spirits in this journey together, and I really hope for good times ahead for the World Cup and for the US national team over there. It's been an absolutely amazing chat. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those listening at home, please head over to greenandgoldfc.com and let us know your thoughts on the episode. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Just search Green and Gold FC. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to follow, rate, and share. It really helps us out. That's all for today. Until next time, it's bye for now.